Chapter 10. Fear. The wind that night was a thrashing wind, a bellowing wind, a prying wind. It battered trees, blasted through glass, and ripped away anything it could get its grip on. Burdock crawled under a cabinet in the tool room and took note of every appalling noise. And the tempest wasn't just at the Baxter farm. In town, in the middle of the night, the gazebo on the village green was wrenched loose from its wooden base and tumbled down the hill to lean affectionately against the information booth. In the morning, the swings at the elementary school were found wrapped tightly around and around the top bar, as if by a troublesome child, and Mr. and Mrs. Kavanaugh's wrought iron bench disappeared off their front porch, only to be discovered upright in their garden, on the other side of the house. "Oh, I like it there," said Mrs. Kavanaugh. "It's poetic." In the Baxter farm kitchen, Dewey slammed around. Early this morning, he had run down the road to check again on the crop of sunflowers. The fields of towering flowers had been only days away from harvest, and Dewey had been counting on this crop to pull him through the year financially. It had been somewhat of a gamble to plant sunflowers in the first place, especially this far north, but the brothers had been told that the market for sunflower oil was growing. They were led to believe that if they could turn a decent harvest, there would be a sizable profit. But any earnings were all gone now. The storm had taken care of that. In the fields, sunflower stalks lay strewn about like giant matchsticks. Overnight, the entire crop had been devastated. Dewey was steamed. "This place!" he bellowed at the empty kitchen, kicking the leg of an old dresser and catapulting dishes to the floor. "Darn Grady for leaving! Darn him for getting out!" Dewey kicked a fallen jar and stood there, practically snarling in his anger. Maybe he should do the same thing. Leave this joint. But then he would need a chunk of cash to get started doing something else. Dewey laid his palms down on the counter, thinking back over his arguments with Grady and with the man who had come just after to collect their money. "Well, Grady, I don't know where you are," yelled Dewey, "but I'm calling the shots now." Digging was much harder than Figgy had hoped, and exhausting. Last night, as midnight came and midnight went, she had raked at the dirt with her hooves and levered with her snout, but still she hadn't broken through. She stepped back to survey her progress. This was a dumb idea, she thought to herself. You can't just tunnel through 100-year-old floor. She hated that she had let everyone believe she could do this. All she wanted to do now was stop, push the hay into a big, soft mountain, and throw herself down on it. She took a step toward her bed, could feel its magnetic pull. How wonderful it would be to flop down, lay her head gratefully to the ground, rustle her body around until it felt just right. As she thought about it, she let herself relax. She bent her knees, readying to give in. Sleep. But something, the tiniest spark of something, pulled her back, snapped her to attention. Maybe it was a small snore from Fluff, or maybe Tick mumbled in his sleep. "Oh, Figgy," she said to herself, straightening. She furrowed her brow and scowled sternly into the dark. To destroy our chance by just giving up would be despicable. She had volunteered herself for this task, and as nearly impossible as it now seemed, the others were depending on her. And so, through the long night, to the rhythm of the rain, from 1 a.m. to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and on to 5, a weary but resolved pig dug and dug and dug and dug. By early morning, when the barn at last stopped shuddering, the torrent on the roof slowed to a trickle, and a ray of early dawn red brightened the east windows. An achy, dirty, and thoroughly worn-out Figgy finally fell gratefully asleep. The horrible creak of the doors announced Dewey's arrival. Figgy jerked awake. "Oh, no! The dirt!" she cried. There was a real pile of it now that hadn't yet been dispersed. In a quick second, Figgy scrambled onto her hooves and attacked the mound, kicking frantically at the dirt, nosing it under the hay, pushing it toward the edges of her pen, and tromping madly to flatten it out. Immediately Nanny saw what was happening. "Burdock!" she hissed. The cat had just emerged from under the tool cabinet and was in the aisle, groggily stretching out his hind legs, one after the other. He stepped now to the side to make room for Dewey when Nanny whispered, "Burdock, stall him!" It took a moment for Burdock to catch on, but he did, just as Dewey was passing, almost to the pig's pen. The cat sprang out in front of Dewey and clipped him at the ankles. Dewey stumbled, caught himself with a hand on Nanny's pen, turned and cursed. "Blast it, Burdock! What's wrong with you?" Dewey gave the cat a rough shove with his boot, knocking Burdock into the pen wall. Figgy didn't have a moment's more time. The dirt was mostly gone, but the hole! She dove against the wall, covering the small pit with her bulk, and squeezed shut her eyes. "Look relaxed," Figgy commanded herself. "Well, don't we look comfortable?" chided Dewey as he righted himself and clomped by. Figgy let out a lungful of air. "Are you all right, love?" whispered Nanny to Burdock. She looked through her pen's slats at the cat. "I think so," said Burdock, shaking his head slowly. He's never done that before. "I know," said Nanny. She paused. "I don't know what would have happened if Dewey had seen the hole. Thank you for doing that, Burdock." Burdock stood for a moment looking up at Nanny. Lately, she had been demanding things of him, but she was kind. Just the way she looked at him made him feel she cared about him. "Why don't you come lie down in here for a while?" offered Nanny now. "Tick and I would be happy for your company." Burdock hesitated, but when Tick stuck his nose out and beamed expectantly, Burdock agreed. Since it was still too wet to pasture the animals, Dewey threw a little hay over the pen walls, dropped a few scant buckets of water into the pens too, and milked Mrs. Brown. Then he closed her back in her stall and headed again toward the front of the barn. "Tug! Pull! Get ready!" he yelled over his shoulder and disappeared into the tool shed. What Dewey did next was this. Number 1, he harnessed up the horses. 2, he brought them outside and hitched them to the small wagon. 3, he backed them slowly into the barn down the wide central aisle. 4, he loaded up every last scrap of the garage equipment, even stripping off the shelving in the cabinets. 5, he moved it all into the woodshed attached to the house. "Oh, my stars," said Nanny in a whisper as she watched. "What?" asked Burdock, noticing the sudden unease in her voice. "Look," said Nanny. It had not escaped the animal's detection that Dewey cared more about his antique car than just about anything. Now it became clear that he was moving his precious garage equipment. Suddenly, any last doubts as to whether Dewey was serious about burning down the barn were gone, and Tug and Pull were being forced to help set their own demise in motion while the other animals watched. "We've got to get out of here," cried Figgy, staring at Dewey's nearly emptied-out room. All that remained was the car itself, Dewey would move that last. How, how's the hole coming? Asked Mrs. Brown. Her voice sounded shaky. Not fast enough, cried Figgy. I can't dig when Dewey's around, so I have to dig at night. And the ground, I'm afraid, is hard. The top was soft, but underneath it's much harder than I thought. Burdock peered through the slats at the pig, whose hooves were cracked, snout chapped, and knees chafed. But what if Dewey sets the barn on fire tonight? Asked Fluff. It was a valid question. Huff, puffed Figgy, heaving an exasperated sigh. I don't know. I'm doing the best I can. Of course you are, Figgy Piggy, said Nanny. We'll sort it out. Even petrified, she couldn't help but be encouraging. Oh, don't be a ninny, Nanny. We could all be pot roast if I don't dig faster. Somehow Nanny's kind words were making Figgy feel worse. The horribleness of the situation was becoming frighteningly real. They each tried not to think about it, to push the thoughts as far away as possible, but everyone's imaginations betrayed them, conjuring up scenes too vivid to ignore. The fire would start at the outside, and they would have to watch the first crackles, the first smoke, as it sulked up the walls, licking the wood tentatively. They would have to watch it intensify, gaining strength and confidence. Watch it begin to gorge greedily, indiscriminately on the old boards. They would have to watch it swell and grow. Watch now as it engulfed everything. Watch its roaring. Watch its speed. Watch it hurtling toward them with a force now so out of control it could not have stopped itself for anything, not if it wanted to. Hold this back? Never. Escape this power? Impossible. Toward them would come at last the devouring heat and flames and destructive power of such massive proportions that it would simply grind down anything and everything in its path, and that would be the end, their end. That this was a real possibility was so completely palpable that it emptied out the chests of the animals, and all that remained was the low, persistent buzz of fear. Burdock really wasn't accustomed to being overwhelmed by fear. You could say he hadn't even felt lasting fear that night as a young cat when he lost his eye. It had happened so quickly, he hadn't had time to feel much of anything. And in the intervening year, he'd hardened up, grown accustomed to the world around him, and was now rarely surprised, let alone afraid. But like the other animals, fear seized Burdock now. It wrapped its cold arms around him and squeezed tight until all he could take were shallow breaths. Dewey was putting his plan into action. There was no question the barn would be coming down. The gray cat ran to the feed room and watched the last loaded up wagon go down the aisle. Pull turned slightly and gave Burdock a knowing, doleful look. Burdock received Pull's warm, brown gaze and held it with his one blue eye. But then, before the horse was past, he looked away. Leave, a voice whispered in the cat's head. Save yourself, it said. Go, it commanded.